I never imagined I'd be a cautionary tale, a father abandoned by his own flesh and blood. Yet, there I was, 68 years old, standing utterly alone in the cavernous departures area of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, Seattle-Tacoma. I watched the taillights of my son Arthur's polished black sedan disappear into the traffic, taking with it my entire connection to the outside world. My wallet, my phone, and any remaining illusion of the man I thought I'd raised. It had all started that morning with an invitation I desperately wanted to believe was sincere. Arthur had called me in my modest apartment in Auburn, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which country you're watching from. Let's see, his voice bubbling with a forced enthusiasm I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. Dad, he'd said, I want to make up for missing your niece's surgery last month. I've booked us a spontaneous week in Palm Springs. Just you and me. I'll pick you up in 2 hours. I should have recognized the alarm bells. Arthur and I hadn't spent any genuine one-on-one time since his mother, Eleanor, passed away 5 years ago. Since he ascended to managing partner at a major downtown venture capital firm, he seemed increasingly embarrassed by my 37 years spent as an honest, independent carpenter. He sat in glass towers. I built them. The drive to the airport was strained. Arthur was clipped and anxious, focused only on his stock updates. When we finally pulled up to the curb at the Delta terminal, he popped the trunk. Just grab your duffel, Dad. I need to get this parked right away. Meet me inside at the check-in for the 1:15 flight. I hauled out my faded canvas duffel bag, the same one that had carried my tools and clothes to countless job sites. Arthur was already pulling away, weaving through the drop-off chaos, before I even turned back toward the terminal entrance. 20 minutes passed, then 40. I stood there, an aging fool, watching travelers embrace, children squealing with excitement, and business people rushing past. When the gate agent asked if I needed assistance, I forced a polite smile and explained I was waiting for my son. The devastating reality slammed into me when I reached for my back pocket. My jacket was empty, my phone gone, my wallet gone. I remembered Arthur insisting that I put my small emergency pouch, the one containing my ID, 2 credit cards, my keys, and the $600 I kept for unexpected expenses, into his car trunk so I wouldn't have to carry it. I'd handed it to him without a second thought. The heavy, crushing sensation in my chest wasn't physical strain. It was the slow, chilling realization that my son, my only child, had purposefully stripped me of everything and abandoned me here. I stood there for another hour, battling the rising panic. Every logical part of me screamed for it to be a mistake. A frantic rush, a forgotten bag. But the speed of Arthur's departure, his tightly controlled anxiety on the drive, it was all too calculated. This was no accident. An airport security officer, a young woman with a kind but serious face, eventually approached me. She was concerned about the old man lingering near the ticketing counter, staring blankly. I tried to explain my predicament, but the words felt shameful. My son, he drove off with my essentials. She was patient but firm. Without a boarding pass, I couldn't remain in the secure terminal. I had to move to the public waiting area. I don't have a single dollar for a bus or a cab, I admitted, the heat of humiliation burning my cheeks. He took my wallet and my keys. Her expression softened from professional concern to genuine pity, which somehow made the isolation worse. She gently suggested I contact someone, a friend, a relative. But my wife, Eleanor, was gone. My brother, George, lived across the country in Boston. Most of my old carpentry crew were either retired far away or passed on. After I sold my small business and retired 4 years ago, my world had narrowed down to my apartment and Arthur's increasingly rare, obligated visits. The officer finally escorted me outside to the passenger pickup area. At least here, I could sit on a hard, concrete bench and try to formulate a plan. It was late September, one of those deceptive Pacific Northwest days where the air was crisp, but the afternoon sun was still warm. Small comfort when your world has just been dismantled. I sat there, watching the vibrant, busy tapestry of arrivals and departures. Families embracing, tourists loading massive luggage, high-powered business travelers rushing to waiting cars. I felt truly old not just in my aching knees and stiff joints, but invisible and disposable. A piece of unwanted luggage. For 30 minutes, I was lost in a fog of disbelief and anger. I played back the subtle cues I had missed. The time Arthur introduced me to his wealthy in-laws as David, an old family friend, instead of his father. The way he'd flinched when I showed up to his office wearing my honest work boots and a plaid shirt, looking out of place among the bespoke suits. I had refused to believe my own child was fundamentally ashamed of the man who built his entire life. "Excuse me, sir." The voice was deep and resonant, worn smooth by decades of command. I looked up to see an elderly gentleman standing over me, easily in his early 80s. He was immaculately dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, the kind that screamed old Seattle money. He leaned on a beautifully carved cherrywood cane, and his silver hair was pulled back neatly. His eyes, though framed by wrinkles, were sharp, intelligent, and unsettlingly direct. "I couldn't help but notice you've been seated here for over an hour, quite still. Are you well?" "I'm fine," I lied automatically. Then, utterly drained of energy for pretense, I added, "No, not fine at all." He gestured to the open space beside me. "May I join you?" I nodded, and he settled onto the bench with careful, measured movements, placing his cane between his knees. We sat in silence for a long moment, watching a limousine pull away. "Waiting for someone?" he finally asked, his voice low. I replied, the word tasting like ash. "My son, but he isn't returning." The old man nodded slowly, processing the information without immediate judgment. "I see. And you have no means of getting back home. No mobile, no wallet, no entry key." "He took everything," I repeated, the bitterness making my throat tight. I must sound utterly pathetic sharing this with a stranger. "Not pathetic," the old man countered quietly. "Just candid. That quality is alarmingly rare these days." He paused, his gaze fixed on the stream of traffic. "How far is your residence?" "Auburn. Maybe 35 kilometers from here. I could manage a walk if I were 20 years younger, but..." I motioned vaguely in my aging body, the one that had been strong enough to frame houses and pour foundations for a lifetime, but now protested every movement. The old man was silent for a prolonged minute. Then, he turned to me with an expression I couldn't decipher, a mix of shrewd assessment and genuine curiosity. "I'm going to present you with a truly unconventional proposition," he stated. "You are completely free to refuse, and I will respect your decision. But I believe we may be able to be of mutual assistance." I looked at him skeptically. "I don't accept charity, sir." "This is not charity. It is, strictly speaking, a calculated business arrangement. A necessary transaction," he clarified, shifting slightly. His knuckles were white on the silver cap of his cane. "My name is Mr. Julian Thorne. I am awaiting my vehicle to transport me home. I was visiting a long-term associate at the adjacent airport hotel, and my armored sedan should arrive within 5 minutes." "Good for you," I muttered, unable to fully suppress my resentment. Here I was financially and physically crippled, while this wealthy man boasted of his imminent chauffeur. Julian Thorne continued, unfazed. "Here is my proposal. I require someone to accompany me to my estate in Broadmoor. Someone who will agree to pose as my long-lost son, returned after a serious, decades-long estrangement. Just for this evening. Just to navigate a single, highly scrutinized dinner with my household manager and my chief legal counsel. In exchange, I will ensure your safe passage home, immediately provide you with a high-end replacement smartphone, and furnish you with $8,000 in cash." I stared at him, sure I had misheard. "You must be jesting." "I assure you, I am not." His eyes were utterly serious. "I'm a very old man, David," he said, using my name which I hadn't given him. "I have a highly complex personal situation and a rapidly diminishing time horizon. My actual son passed away nearly 20 years ago. Since then, an assortment of grasping relatives and opportunists have appeared, hoping to secure a piece of my substantial estate. I am weary of it. I am exhausted by everyone viewing me solely as an asset to be liquidated. So you want me to pretend to be a dead man's returning brother? or something. I stumbled over the words. That's absurd. Why go to such lengths? Because I want to see how my immediate circle reacts when they believe the rightful heir, the one they assume is out of the picture, has miraculously reappeared. I need to observe their true, unfiltered response before my final will is executed. Julian Thorne looked straight in my eyes. You possess a fundamentally honest face. The face of a man who has worked with his hands. Right now, you are in desperate need of aid, and I require someone who has absolutely zero interest in manipulating me for long-term gain. A sleek, black Maybach sedan glided to the curb, and a uniformed driver stepped out. Mr. Thorne, sir. Ready for departure. Julian Thorne rose slowly, supported by his cane. The choice is yours. Mr. Campbell. David Campbell. I corrected automatically. Mr. Campbell, you can elect to walk away right now, and I will wish you well. Or you can enter this vehicle, dedicate a few hours to assisting an old man's social experiment, and depart substantially better positioned than you are at this moment. What is your final answer? Every rational voice in my head screamed that this was reckless, utterly bizarre, and potentially risky. But I looked at that formidable sedan, then back at the punishing kilometers of walking before me, and I recalled Arthur's face, a flicker of relief as he sped away. What, precisely, would be my role? I asked. Simply be yourself. Refer to me as father or dad on occasion. Conduct yourself like a son who has been separated but has genuinely returned home. My staff and counsel expect me for the evening meal. Let them see you. Let them deliberate. That is the full extent of the requirement. Julian Thorne extended a hand, old and spotted, yet conveying immense strength. Do we have a mutual agreement? I looked at that hand. I thought of Arthur's selfish, calculated abandonment. I shook Julian Thorne's hand. Deal. The drive into Broadmoor was akin to passing through a veil into a completely different stratum of existence. I had spent nearly 4 decades building and renovating properties across the Seattle area, but I had only ever seen neighborhoods like this from the perspective of a contractor behind scaffolding or through the iron gates. The houses were not merely large. They were sprawling, historic estates with perfectly manicured grounds, towering old-growth trees, and a hushed, settled wealth that felt centuries deep. Julian Thorne's residence was on a secluded, tree-lined street where the fall leaves were turning magnificent shades of fiery crimson and deep gold. The Maybach pulled silently into a circular driveway in front of a 3-story gray stone manor that looked like it belonged on the coast of Maine, not in the middle of a metropolitan city. "Welcome home, son," Julian said, his voice carrying a subtle, almost theatrical gravity. I detected a momentary flash in his eyes. Was it a test, or perhaps a flicker of genuine, wistful emotion? The driver immediately opened my door, and I stepped out onto smooth, pristine granite pavers. Before we reached the massive, oak-paneled front door, a woman in her late 50s appeared, emerging from the shadows of the foyer. Her uniform was impeccable, and her initial expression of professional welcome instantly fractured into profound shock. "Mr. Thorne, you failed to mention you were returning with. Is this?" She looked rapidly back and forth between us, her confusion palpable. "Penelope, I would like you to meet Mr. David Campbell," Julian said smoothly, resting his hand gently on my shoulder. "My son, he has finally returned home after many years." Penelope's face cycled through disbelief, confusion, and then something that undeniably registered as stark disappointment. "Your son," she repeated, her voice thin. "But I was under the impression that—" "I'm aware of your impression, Penelope," Julian interrupted, his tone gentle yet authoritative. "Life, as you know, has a habit of providing immense surprises. David will be joining us for the evening meal. Please ensure the main dining room is prepared." Penelope nodded stiffly, the professional facade snapping back into place, and she disappeared into the depths of the mansion. I felt profoundly out of place, like a character forced onto a stage without having read the script. Why did she look disappointed? I whispered as we stepped into the grand, echoing foyer. Julian's smile was thin and dry. Because Penelope's sister's husband, Mr. Harrison Vance, a notably opportunistic man, has been relentlessly attending to my affairs lately, utterly convinced he is poised to inherit the lion's share of this estate. Now come, allow me to offer you a brief tour. The interior was precisely what I expected of Gilded Age wealth. Gleaming, dark hardwood floors, museum-quality antique furniture, and original oil paintings adorning every wall. What struck me, however, was not the staggering display of affluence, but the crushing sense of emptiness. This enormous house contained one very old, lonely man and his household manager. Julian led me to a stately sitting room featuring floor-to-ceiling bay windows that overlooked an elaborate formal garden. The truth, David, is that I was not entirely forthcoming with you at the airport. My guard immediately went up. What do you mean, Mr. Thorne? This evening is not simply about observing people's financial reactions. It is about— He paused, looking out at the meticulously maintained garden beds. I have spent the last 18 years utterly alone within these walls. Ever since my dear wife passed, just a year after my son. Every day, I am besieged by people. Distant relatives I haven't seen since childhood, business partners posturing for control, my legal counsel pressuring me ceaselessly to finalize my documents. Everyone, David, want a piece of me, and you're simply tired of it. I finished, understanding fully. I am dying, David, he said matter-of-factly. Stage 4 adenocarcinoma. I possess perhaps 6 months, potentially less. And in these final months, I have achieved a stark realization. I never adequately processed the grief for my son. I never allowed myself to truly envision what life might have been like had he lived, had we successfully mended our rupture. You had a serious falling out, I stated. Julian nodded, his gaze distant. James wished to dedicate his life to dramatic theater and writing. I, the mining and timber magnate, insisted he enter the executive training program and assume control of the family corporation. We exchanged unforgivable, terrible words. He relocated to New York City and, 3 years later, he perished in a sudden taxi accident. We never spoke again. I never told him I was profoundly proud of the man he had become, that I was wrong. The immense weight of his confession settled heavily in the quiet room. This wasn't merely a strategic maneuver or a test of avarice. This was a desperate, final attempt by a dying man to suture a deep, festering emotional wound. So, you desire for me to emulate him? I asked softly. No, I want you to be the son who came back. Not James. I am not delusional, David. But you are the son I wished I had been granted a second chance with. The son who returned before the window, closed forever. Julian looked at me directly. And in return, I will give you something equally vital. A chance to witness that not all fathers and sons are destined for the path you and Arthur are currently traversing. We sat in quiet contemplation. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long, elegant shadows across the lawn. One dinner, I confirmed. One dinner. And then you are free to depart with my deepest gratitude, the replacement phone, and the promised cash. Julian Thorne extended his hand for a second time. However, I hold a strong intuition that you might find yourself inclined to linger a little longer. I shook his hand, still profoundly uncertain of the gravity of my agreement. But something in Julian Thorne's resolute eyes resonated with the memory of my own deceased father, a man who had worked himself into an early grave on factory floors, never afforded the luxury of final reconciliation or second chances. Penelope called us to dinner precisely at 6 o'clock. The main dining table could have easily accommodated 24 guests, but it was formally set for 4 people. Julian sat regally at the head, and I took the seat immediately to his right. 2 additional places were set directly across from us. Who else is joining us for this production? I asked, keeping my voice low. My chief legal counsel, Mr. Leonard Finch, Julian replied, his voice dry. He has demonstrated an increasingly aggressive interest in the precise wording of my last testament. And the aforementioned Harrison Vance, Penelope's relative. He has been excessively attentive, almost annoyingly so, offering constant assistance with my financial affairs. Julian paused, his lip curling slightly. They should both find the opportunity to meet you immensely intriguing. The antique doorbell chimed, and moments later, a thin man in a conspicuously expensive yet ill-fitting suit entered, followed by the younger man, Harrison. Harrison looked like a professional athlete who spent more time meticulously tracking his fitness than his investments. Both men stopped dead upon seeing me. "Leonard, Harrison," Julian began smoothly. "I would like you to formally meet David Campbell." He waited a beat, allowing the tension to coil. "My son." Leonard Finch, the lawyer, recovered first, his face a mask of calculated disbelief. "Robert, I mean Julian. I feel there must be a considerable error. Your son James tragically passed in 2006. David is certainly not James. David is my son from a significant relationship that occurred before I met my wife, Eleanor," Julian declared, completing the statement with unassailable calm. "I have recently and quite unexpectedly reconnected with him." The room plunged into profound silence. I could almost hear the frantic internal calculations taking place in both men's minds. The rapid reassessment of inheritance percentages, the immediate need to pivot their manipulative strategies. Harrison Vance plastered on a wide, artificial smile that failed to reach his predatory eyes. "Uncle Julian, this is quite the revelation. You never once alluded to another son." "There are numerous deeply personal matters I have elected not to share, Harrison," Julian responded, his voice cool and utterly dismissive. "David, please take your seat. Let us begin the meal." The dinner that followed was, without question, one of the most acutely uncomfortable experiences of my entire life. I once endured a 7-hour flight sitting next to a man who cataloged every single detail of his disastrous home renovation. This was worse. Leonard Finch, the lawyer, persistently directed pointed, intrusive questions toward me, questions about my mother, specific dates from my childhood, and minute geographic details to which I naturally had no credible answers. Julian deflected every single inquiry with seamless elegance, citing discretion, privacy, and the need to respect deeply sensitive old wounds. Harrison, meanwhile, watched me with the intense, predatory focus of a hawk tracking prey. "So, David," Harrison drawled, his tone condescendingly patronizing, "what career have you cultivated for yourself? What do you do?" "I am currently retired now. I spent the better part of 4 decades working as an independent carpenter, building things. I saw no benefit in concealing my honest trade." "Carpentry," Harrison echoed, his forced smile widening in obvious judgment. "How industrious. And you're only now, after all these years, deciding to reconnect with your father? With his immense wealth. Sometimes it requires losing absolutely everything you possess to realize what genuinely matters," I stated, the words erupting with more raw truth than I intended, thinking instantly of Arthur's betrayal and my abandonment at the airport just hours ago. Julian reached over instantly and squeezed my arm in a gesture of paternal affirmation. "Well stated, my son. Extremely well stated." I watched as Leonard and Harrison exchanged a silent, venomous glance. Whatever scenario they had meticulously planned for this evening, my conspicuous presence was clearly demolishing their expectations. Following the meal, Leonard Finch cornered Julian in the private study for a conversation I could hear growing steadily louder. Leonard's voice was incredulous and desperate. Julian's was steady and unshakable. Harrison seized the opportunity to corner me in the long hallway. "Look, I don't know what elaborate, low-budget charade you've been hired to perform," he hissed, his face tight with barely suppressed rage. "But my legitimate family, has been dutifully attending to Uncle Julian for years. You don't simply appear out of thin air and immediately expect." "Expect what exactly?" I cut him off, meeting his gaze evenly. "I expect a dinner. Robert Julian invited me to his home for a meal. That is the complete extent of the expectation." "Right." A mysteriously reappeared, long-lost son shows up mere months before a wealthy, ailing man passes away. "What a spectacular coincidence," Harrison sneered, his face turning an angry shade of scarlet. My own legal counsel will be exceedingly interested in this sudden and highly irregular development. He stormed away, leaving me alone in the cavernous hallway, grappling with the deepening complexity of the situation. This was supposed to be a straightforward financial transaction, a few hours of pretense for $8,000 and a ride home. It was rapidly spiraling into something far more dangerous. Julian found me, standing there moments later. My apologies for their utterly vulgar display. But now, you have witnessed precisely the nature of the challenges I contend with on a daily basis. Everyone here measures my intrinsic worth purely by the size of my bank account. I should depart, I announced. I have fulfilled the terms of our agreement. This is becoming entirely too volatile and messy. Stay the night, David, Julian insisted, his fatigue suddenly visible. It is late, and I sincerely doubt you are eager to return to an apartment you cannot physically enter without keys. Tomorrow, I will arrange for a private locksmith, replace your phone, and provide the promised funds. He fixed me with a plea in his eyes. Please, David, just one night. These old walls feel unbearably desolate. Something in his vulnerable voice pierced my weary armor. Perhaps it was the deep, shared loneliness I recognized, the same creeping isolation that had infiltrated my own life since retirement. Or maybe, more simply, I had nowhere else safe to go. One night, I conceded. Julian led me to a guest suite that was objectively larger than my entire apartment back in Auburn. It featured a colossal four-poster bed, an en-suite bathroom with radiant heated floors, and a private window overlooking the moonlit garden. He had thoughtfully laid out fresh, tailored clothes in my size. He had planned this contingency. Thank you, Julian, I said, and the gratitude was genuine, not merely for the luxurious accommodation, but for the profound reminder that not all people operated like Arthur, that true kindness could still surface in the most improbable places. No, David, thank you, Julian said, standing in the doorway, appearing suddenly small and utterly exhausted. You have given a dying man a tremendous gift this day, a chance to imagine what might have been. That is a value far exceeding any monetary compensation. That night, I lay in a bed that felt softer than any cloud, in a house that represented a level of wealth I had only ever built for others, and I contemplated the surreal, twisted path my life had taken. Only 24 hours earlier, I had been preparing for a restorative trip with my son, still holding onto the fragile belief in a genuine reconciliation. Now, I was posing as a stranger's returning heir, inadvertently trapped in a high-stakes drama involving avarice and inheritance. Yet, here is what struck me most profoundly. Julian Thorne, despite his enormous fortune, was fundamentally a lonely, dying man attempting to resolve a lifetime of regrets. In that essential human way, we were kindred spirits. We were both fathers who had lost our sons, his to the finality of death, mine to the toxic shame of class and greed. I finally fell asleep around midnight, and my dreams were filled with images of Arthur as a small boy, before everything became contaminated. I saw him sitting proudly on my shoulders at construction sites, wearing my oversized hard hat, firing off a million questions about the structural integrity of a foundation. I remembered when he was genuinely proud to boast that his father built solid, enduring structures. I woke to the dazzling sunlight streaming through the unfamiliar, massive window and the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. For a disorienting second, I had no reference for my location. Then, the full, absurd reality returned. The airport, Julian Thorne, the hostel dinner. I half expected it to dissolve into a strange fever dream, but the luxurious Egyptian cotton sheets were real. The warmth of the heated marble bathroom floor was real. And when I went downstairs, Julian was real, too, sitting at a table near a sunny bay window, meticulously reading the Seattle Times. "Good morning, my son," he said, and there was a subtle difference in his voice, a lightness, a palpable ease I hadn't heard before. "Did you manage to rest well?" "Better than I have in years," I admitted, seating myself. "Look, Julian, about yesterday. Before this progresses further." "David, please," he interrupted, setting down his newspaper. "I have a proposal for you. A genuine one this time. No elaborate pretense is required. Stay here for 1 week," he said. "Just 7 days. Assist me with a few minor organizational projects around the house. Provide me with company. Allow me the comfort of arranging my affairs with peace of mind. You pour me a cup of coffee. At the conclusion of the week, I will compensate you $25,000 in addition to everything I guaranteed yesterday." I sat down heavily, the sheer amount of money momentarily staggering me. "Why, Julian? Why me?" "Because, David, in the last 18 years, you are the single individual who has appeared in my life who does not want something from me. You didn't even wish to be here initially. That, my friend, is a refreshing level of honesty I desperately needed to encounter." Julian gave a faint smile. "And because I am selfish enough to require the experience of having a companionable man around the house again, even if it is strictly borrowed time." "What about Leonard and Harrison?" I asked. "They will absolutely challenge this. They'll demand my immediate departure." "Let them," Julian replied, his smile hardening into something sharp and decisive. "It is my money, my substantial estate, and my personal choice. Legally, I am absolutely within my rights to host a guest. Leonard can bluster and threaten all he likes. I should have instantly refused. This entire arrangement was spiraling far too deep, becoming entangled and messy. But I thought about my empty, cold apartment, my lack of keys, and the crushing depth of Arthur's calculated betrayal. I had absolutely nothing pressing to rush back to. And then I thought of Julian, a distinguished man dying entirely alone in this colossal house, surrounded by parasites who viewed him purely as a final, lucrative payday. 1 week, I said, but I am no longer pretending to be your returning son. I will assist you, keep you company, but there will be no further falsehoods about who I fundamentally am. Deal." Julian extended his hand for the third time. And this time, when our hands connected, it felt significantly less like a cold business contract and far more like the genesis of an entirely unexpected, genuine companionship. That week transformed into the most peculiar, unanticipated period of my later life. Julian kept me occupied with meaningful tasks, meticulously organizing his vast, leather-bound library collection, helping to photograph and catalog his original Pacific Northwest art, and often just sitting companionably with him in the serene garden while he recounted vivid stories from his early career in mining and timber. We discovered we shared a startling amount in common, despite the colossal disparity in our financial status. We were both self-made men who started with nothing and built lasting structures, whether of wood or of capital. Penelope, the household manager, slowly began to warm to me after the initial days, once she grasped that my presence was not an attempt to fleece her employer. "He has been substantially different since your arrival," she confided one afternoon while bringing us tea in the garden. "More animated, more like his self of 2 decades ago." Harrison Vance, conversely, became increasingly overt in his hostility. He materialized unannounced multiple times, always armed with new accusations or aggressive demands. During one particularly ugly confrontation, he aggressively accused me of elder financial abuse and threatened to contact the police department. Julian shut him down instantly and decisively. "Harrison," Julian stated, his voice ringing with authority, "I am of entirely sound mind and body, or at least as sound as a man facing my condition can be. David is my invited guest and my friend. If you cannot conduct yourself civilly, you will be permanently barred from entry to this residence." Harrison was forced to leave, but not before shooting me a look that promised utter destruction. On the 4th day, something profoundly unexpected occurred. I was in Julian's impressive study, assisting him in going through dusty, leather-bound photo albums, when he showed me a large framed photograph of James, his deceased son. There was no physical resemblance between James and me. James was shorter, had darker hair, and was aesthetically different, but something in his eyes, a flicker of artistic stubbornness, reminded me painfully of Arthur at that age. "What was the core of your conflict?" I asked, looking at the young man frozen in time. You and James. Julian was silent for a profound, long moment. Control. Utter, selfish control. I demanded he live the life I had meticulously planned for him business school, eventually taking over the family conglomerate, all of it. He wanted to paint, to write, to create theater, to live his life authentically. I unforgivably told him he was utterly squandering his prodigious talent. Julian's voice cracked, and he cleared his throat. The very last words I spoke to him were that if he walked out of my door, he was no longer my son. And he walked out. 3 years later, his roommate called me regarding the accident. James was driving home from a gallery showing where his conceptual work had finally received critical acclaim. He had finally found immense success doing what he loved most. And I had missed every single moment of it because I was far too arrogant and stubborn to admit I had been profoundly wrong. I looked at the framed photograph of that promising young man, and my thoughts drifted immediately to Arthur. I, too, had pushed my son to follow my own blueprint, working with his hands, learning a trade. I had been openly disappointed when he chose the world of universities, high finance, and a sophisticated business environment I fundamentally didn't understand. That silent, corrosive disappointment had driven an emotional wedge between us that grew wider with every passing year. Do you believe Arthur will ever genuinely forgive me? I asked quietly. For what, David? Julian looked genuinely surprised. For working tirelessly to provide him with opportunity? For being an honest, devoted father? For not being the right kind of father? I said, the words heavy with shame. For embarrassing him? For being too working class, too rough around the edges for his corporate world? He is fundamentally ashamed of me, Julian. That is why he executed that abandonment at the airport. Julian gently set down the photo album. Then Arthur is operating as a fool. But fools are sometimes capable of learning. The central question is, David, do you want him to have that chance for growth? I had no ready answer. A large part of me wanted to permanently sever all ties with Arthur, to write him off in the same painful manner he had written me off. But another part, the part that remembered teaching him to ride a bike, the countless bedtime stories, holding him tightly when his mother died, that part still ached too profoundly to simply let go. I simply do not know, I admitted. Neither did I, Julian said simply. And then it was permanently too late. David, do not replicate my mistake. On the 5th day, Leonard Finch, Julian's lawyer, arrived with a thick file of papers. He had clearly dedicated the past few days to extensive investigation and had uncovered the simple truth. I was not Julian's long-lost son from a previous relationship. He seemed almost disappointed that the revelation wasn't more dramatically scandalous. We possess the factual information regarding your identity, Mr. Campbell, Leonard announced, attempting to sound triumphant. You are merely a retired carpenter, a total stranger Robert Julian picked up off a bench. I have never asserted otherwise, I said calmly, meeting his gaze. Julian knows my entire life story. Leonard turned to Julian, his exasperation bordering on panic. Julian, this is utter insanity. You are granting a complete stranger access to your intimate home, your most private affairs. I harbor extremely serious concerns regarding your cognitive judgment. Your concerns are duly noted, Leonard, and they are unequivocally dismissed, Julian replied, his voice firm and unwavering. David is my friend. That is the only necessary information you require. Now, Julian continued, unless you have genuinely substantive legal business to discuss, I strongly suggest you depart immediately. Leonard left, but not without delivering a final, ominous warning that Julian was committing an irreversible, tragic mistake, and that people would seriously question his mental capacity if my presence continued. After he was gone, Julian looked utterly drained. I sincerely apologize that you had to endure that display of pettiness. I'm far more concerned about you, I stated. Are you absolutely certain this is worth all this dramatic confrontation? David, Julian said, looking me straight in the eye, I have spent 15 years attempting to purchase my way out of debilitating loneliness. 15 years surrounded exclusively by individuals who craved my money, yet had zero interest in me as a person. This week, having you here having authentic, unmanipulated conversations with someone who expects absolutely nothing from me, it has been the most genuinely peaceful period I have known since Eleanor died. That, David, is worth any measure of drama. That evening, over dinner, Julian asked me about my life. He didn't ask the usual superficial, polite questions. He asked the deep, searching questions. What had been the source of my greatest happiness? What were my deepest regrets? If I were granted the power to reset my life, what single thing would I fundamentally change? I found myself speaking candidly about my late wife, Eleanor. I described how we had met at a small cafe where she was working to pay for her nursing school tuition. How she had seen something worthwhile in the rough, 19-year-old carpenter that I couldn't perceive in myself. How she had profoundly believed in me, supported every endeavor, and loved me despite my evident rough edges. She sounds like an extraordinary woman, Julian remarked softly. I confirmed. She passed away 12 years ago. Cancer. I realized I hadn't truly discussed Eleanor with anyone in years. Arthur rarely wanted to speak about her. The pain was too acute. But with Julian, the conversation felt entirely natural, even necessary. She made me genuinely aspire to be a better man than I naturally was. After she passed, I stopped trying to be that man. Is that the precise moment things began to shift with Arthur? Julian inquired. Perhaps. He was always intensely ambitious, always aspiring for a life that transcended the one we had. Eleanor served as the necessary counterbalance, keeping him grounded. After she was gone, I shrugged, unable to fully articulate the loss. I lost them both, Julian, only in profoundly different ways. Julian reached across the vast table and firmly gripped my hand. I'm deeply sorry, David, for all of it. We sat there, two old men who had loved and tragically lost, who had made significant mistakes and were now living with the corrosive weight of regret. In that singular, powerful moment, Julian was not a multi-millionaire magnate, and I was not a retired construction worker. We were simply two fathers desperately attempting to find meaning in the complex, broken relationships we held with our respective sons. On the sixth day, the temporary phone Julian had purchased for me rang. The number was blocked, but an instinct compelled me to answer it. Dad, Arthur's voice was tentative, almost submerged in uncertainty. Dad, is that truly you? My chest immediately constricted. It is. I've been attempting to reach you frantically for days, he rushed to explain. Your old phone has been routing straight to voicemail, and when I went to your apartment, you weren't there. I honestly started to think. He hesitated. Where are you, Dad? Somewhere entirely safe, which is absolutely no thanks to you. The acute, suppressed rage from the past 6 days erupted. You left me at the airport, Arthur. You deliberately took my wallet, my phone, and my apartment keys, and then you intentionally drove away. There was a long, heavy silence on the line. When Arthur finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I know precisely what I did. And Dad, I am so incredibly sorry. I panicked. I saw your emergency pouch in my trunk, and instead of turning the car around, I just kept driving. I rationalized that you would figure it out, that you would be perfectly fine. But you weren't answering your phone, and I realized, God, Dad, I am profoundly sorry. Why? The question emerged from my throat, ragged and hoarse. Why did you truly do it? Another prolonged pause. Because I was overcome with shame. Tiffany's parents, her family is coming on that Palm Springs trip with us, and I couldn't face them seeing you, Dad. The way you dress, the straightforward way you talk, all those stories about building things. They are so ridiculously refined, and I knew they would judge me severely for having a father who operates so completely outside of their elite world. Every single word was a direct, agonizing cut, but at least the honesty was finally there. So, you simply chose to abandon me instead. I'm a coward, Dad. I've been operating as a coward for years, and I am genuinely sorry. Please tell me your current location. Let me come to retrieve you. Let me finally try to make this right. I glanced around Julian's beautiful study at the man who had demonstrated more paternal concern for me in 6 days than my own son had in years. I am currently staying with a friend, and I am not ready to see you, Arthur. Not yet. What you did, I require significant time to process it. But, Dad, I will contact you when I am prepared. Do not attempt to call this specific number again. And Arthur, I paused, the final words emerging with painful clarity. Take a long, hard, objective look at the man you have become, because your mother would be deeply ashamed. And right now, I am too. I ended the call before he could articulate a response. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. Julian had been sitting quietly in the corner, ostensibly reading a technical journal, but I knew he had absorbed every single word. Was I too harsh on him? I asked, putting the temporary phone down. No, David. You were necessary and honest. That is precisely what he was required to hear, Julian said, closing his journal. The central question now remains, what do you require? What did I require? I had spent 6 surreal days living this extraordinary life, feeling a sense of belonging I hadn't felt in my own apartment. I had forged an intense bond with a complete stranger, a dying man in a way I had never managed with my own son. But this beautiful, temporary reality could not sustain itself. Julian's time was finite, and my real, messy life was waiting. I need to figure out the path to genuinely forgive him, I said finally. But I have no idea where to even begin. Begin with forgiving yourself, David, Julian instructed. Forgive yourself for whatever perceived role you played in the wedge between you. It is never, ever just one person's sole fault when a fundamental relationship shatters. That evening marked my final night under the roof of Julian Thorne's estate. In keeping with our agreement, he insisted on an elaborate celebratory dinner, just the two of us. Penelope prepared a magnificent, multi-course meal, and Julian opened a bottle of antique Bordeaux that I knew instinctively was worth more than my monthly retirement pension. To unlikely and deeply genuine friendships, Julian toasted, raising his glass, his eyes bright. To second chances, I added, clinking my glass against his. Over the rich, dark chocolate dessert, Julian grew serious, his gaze steady and intense. David, there is something absolutely critical I must share with you. This past week has carried an intrinsic meaning for me that you cannot possibly comprehend. You have provided me with something I was certain I would never experience again. The chance to be a father, even if only in a temporary, metaphorical sense. Julian, I started, feeling a deep surge of emotion. He held up his hand, stopping me gently. Allow me to finish. Tomorrow morning, Leonard is returning to finalize the execution of my will. I have enacted significant, profound amendments based directly upon the experiences of these past 7 days, and I wanted you to hear them directly from me first. My stomach immediately plummeted. Julian, if you are attempting to include me in your last testament, I must respectfully decline. That is emphatically not the reason I agreed to remain here. I know that, David. That precisely is the reason I am proceeding with it, Julian said, offering a faint, knowing smile. Do not be alarmed. I am not bequeathing you the entirety of my corporation or my immense fortune. The majority of my estate is being allocated to establish a massive foundation dedicated to supporting emerging writers and dramatists in James's memory. They will finally receive the crucial support and belief he never received from me during his life. That is a truly beautiful and noble legacy, I said, genuinely moved by the depth of his intention. But I am leaving you this house. I nearly choked on the wine I was attempting to swallow. What? No, Julian, absolutely not. I cannot possibly accept something of that magnitude. You can, and you absolutely will, he stated with finality. Here is my rational calculation. Harrison will inevitably contest the will regardless of what sum I allocate him. So, I'm leaving him a very substantial cash settlement, specifically $3 million, a figure that ensures the expense of legally contesting the document will far outweigh any potential gain. Leonard receives his fees plus a sizable bonus for his inevitable trouble. Penelope receives her full pension and a considerable, fully vested retirement fund. But this house, Julian looked around the elegant, silent room at the very walls that had protected him for decades. This house requires someone who will truly appreciate it, David. Not merely for its colossal monetary value, but for what it fundamentally represents, a true home. You grasp that distinction, David, in a way no one else currently in my life does. However, there are non-negotiable conditions. Julian paused, his eyes twinkling slightly. You cannot sell this property for a period of 7 years. You must reside within it for a minimum of 6 months of every year. And he leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. You must use the dedicated guest suite to aid at least one person annually, utilizing the space the same way I aided you. Someone who is utterly stripped bare and in desperate need of a second chance, a secure space to reorient their life. Keep the guest room consistently ready, David. You can never predict who may truly require it. I sat in stunned silence as Julian continued. Tomorrow, when Leonard arrives, he will formally read the will. Harrison will likely erupt in a spectacular, predictable fashion. It will be exceptionally dramatic and profoundly uncomfortable. But I need you present in that room, David. I need the only person who will be there for the correct, honest reasons. And what are the correct reasons? I asked, finding my voice. Friendship. Pure, unadulterated friendship. Julian raised his glass again, holding it steady. Can you do that final act for me? I thought about the complex lessons of the past week. The power of forgiveness, the value of choosing family, and the profound companionship found in two lonely old men bonding over an airport abandonment. Yes, I said finally. I can absolutely do that, Julian. The next morning, I woke before dawn and found Julian already dressed in his finest charcoal suit, looking every inch the formidable timber and mining magnate he had once been. Penelope had tears in her eyes when she saw us together at the breakfast table. You are both far too headstrong for your own eventual good, she said, but she was smiling genuinely. Leonard Finch arrived promptly at 10 o'clock, his expression grim and professional. Harrison Vance entered with him, accompanied by a sharp-looking woman. I didn't recognize Harrison's corporate lawyer, evidently. The reading was to take place in Julian's impressive study, and the tension in the room was almost physically palpable. Leonard cleared his throat, holding the official document. Julian, before we officially commence, I must inquire one final time. Are you absolutely certain regarding these complex amendments? Do you fully comprehend that they will most assuredly be contested? I comprehend it perfectly, Leonard, Julian replied, his voice firm and strong. Read the testament. What transpired next was exactly the spectacular drama Julian had expertly predicted. The announcement of the extensive James Thorne Foundation for the Arts was met with tight-lipped, professional approval. Penelope's substantial retirement fund brought genuine, quiet tears to her eyes. Harrison's cash settlement, the cooling $3 million, should have been generous, but his face darkened visibly as he comprehended the implied meaning. This was his final, non-negotiable share. And the principal residence, Harrison demanded, his voice suddenly loud. The Broadmoor estate and all its property? Leonard looked deeply uncomfortable, clearing his throat again. The house, all furnishings, and the encompassing property are bequeathed to David Campbell, subject to the stipulated conditions contained herein. Harrison instantly exploded. This is preposterous. This is utter madness. He has known this man for only 1 week, 7 days, and you are awarding him a property conservatively valued at $18 million. Yes, Julian said calmly, meeting his nephew's furious gaze. That is precisely what I am executing. We will fight this in the highest court, Harrison's lawyer interjected, her voice clipped and aggressive. There are absolutely clear grounds for immediate contesting based on undue influence and serious questions regarding competency. Attempt it, Julian interrupted, his voice cutting through the chaos with surprising, sharp force. I have had 3 independent, board-certified psychiatrists evaluate me over the past 3 months, specifically to preempt such baseless claims. I am of sound mind, demonstrably clear judgment, and this decision is my free and conscious choice. David Campbell is receiving this house, not because he avariciously requested it, but because he is the single individual who entered my life in the past 15 years who demanded nothing from me. The room erupted into simultaneous arguments, bitter accusations, and threats of legal retaliation. Leonard attempted to restore order, while Harrison shouted vitriol about family loyalty and Julian's clearly diminished capacity. Through the chaos, I sat quietly, still processing the overwhelming magnitude of Julian's gift. Finally, Julian slowly stood up, his voice cutting through the noise with unexpected command. Enough. This is my house until my last breath, and I will not permit it to be saturated with this kind of toxic ugliness. Harrison, you have received your inheritance. It is significantly more than generous. If you elect to squander it on protracted legal action attempting to extract more, that is your decision. But you must know this. The sole reason you are receiving anything at all is because your Aunt Eleanor loved you. If the decision were mine alone, after the manner in which you have treated me, you would receive nothing. Harrison's face flushed violently, shifting from white to deep crimson. You ungrateful. Get out. Julian's voice was ice. All of you, except for David and Penelope. Depart my house immediately. Leonard professionally gathered his documents, his face a perfectly neutral mask. Harrison's lawyer looked as if she wished to argue, but thought better of it. Harrison himself stood there, visibly shaking with absolute fury, before finally storming out with a final, choked threat. This is not remotely finished. When they were finally gone, Julian collapsed back into his leather chair, suddenly appearing every bit of his 80-odd years. Penelope rushed immediately to his side. Dr. Henderson should be called now, she said worriedly. No, I am quite fine. Penelope, merely exhausted, Julian said. He looked up at me. That, David, transpired approximately as well as it could have reasonably expected. Julian, I cannot possibly accept this, I repeated. Not if it is going to cause this much personal and legal turmoil. The turmoil is not your fault, David. The turmoil exists because I permitted people like Harrison to believe they were entitled to my resources simply because we shared DNA. Julian reached for my hand. David, I desperately want you to have this house. Not because you need it, though God knows a retired carpenter could use the security, but because I know you will transform it into a genuine home, not just a transactional real estate asset. Promise me you will maintain the guest suite. Promise me you will help someone else, precisely the way I aided you. I looked around the stately study, imagining the room filled with the warm sound of laughter instead of bitter legal arguments, with life instead of immense loneliness. I promise. Penelope squeezed both our hands. Julian, you stubborn, wonderful old fool. You have executed a truly good thing. I have done the only thing that felt fundamentally right. Julian smiled faintly. David, I think I must rest now. But tomorrow, I wish to personally show you how the entire estate operates. The maintenance finances, the specific house systems, all the practicalities. Can you remain here a bit longer? As long as you require me, I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. That evening, my temporary phone rang again. Arthur. I almost ignored it, but something compelled me to answer. Dad, please do not disconnect, he said quickly, his voice urgent. I found out where you have been residing. Tiffany's family lawyer casually mentioned something about Julian Thorne's will, and Dad, is it factually true? Did he actually leave you that enormous house? The legal circuit clearly worked faster than light. How did you find out, Dash? Tiffany's parents know Leonard Finch. They are absolutely furious because apparently Harrison's family is claiming, and Arthur paused. Dad, they're asserting that you brazenly conned a fragile old man. Of course they are, I said, the bitterness returning. Because someone with my background could not possibly have earned anything legitimately. That is not what I think. Arthur's voice was sharp with urgency. Dad, I've spent the last week contemplating what I did about the man I have consciously chosen to become. You were unequivocally correct. Mom will be ashamed. I am ashamed. And when I learned about Mr. Thorne's testament, my initial thought was not that you conned anyone. My first thought was that, of course, he saw in you exactly what I have been too blind and self-absorbed to notice. I felt something finally crack open in my heart. And what precisely is that, Arthur? That you are fundamentally a good man, that you are honest, that you are kind, and you are loyal in all the things I deliberately labeled as embarrassing were actually the finest, most enduring qualities about you. Dad, His voice broke completely. I threw away my father because I was terrified of what shallow people would think. And now, a complete stranger valued you more than I did. I do not deserve your forgiveness, Arthur finished, but I am begging for it anyway. I closed my eyes, thinking of Julian and James, of the crucial words that were tragically left unspoken, the second chances that were never seized. I thought about the vast difference between being technically right and being genuinely happy. Come for the evening meal tomorrow night, I said. 6 o'clock. Bring Tiffany and my grandson, Ethan. It is time you met Julian properly. Truly, Dad? Do you genuinely mean it? Tomorrow. 6 o'clock. Do not be late. I gave him the estate's address. After I hung up, I located Julian in the garden, wrapped in a blanket despite the mild evening air. He looked utterly peaceful, staring up at the darkening, clear sky. I invited Arthur for dinner tomorrow, I informed him. Julian smiled without diverting his gaze from the stars. Excellent. A house such as this is meant to be filled with family, even the imperfect ones. Especially the imperfect ones. Especially the imperfect ones, I agreed, sitting beside him. We sat in a comfortable, deep silence, and I contemplated the surreal journey that had delivered me to this moment. A single week ago, I had been completely abandoned at a terminal, stripped of every essential possession, convinced my life had bottomed out. Now, I was sitting in an $18 million garden, poised to inherit a life I could never have conceived, with a concrete chance to painstakingly rebuild the relationship I thought was broken beyond any repair. Thank you, Julian, I said simply, for everything. Thank you, David, for profoundly reminding me what it feels like to fully be a father again, even if only for a very brief while.